and meet some folks from that I probably otherwise wouldn't have been able to travel up and do this. And so I hope you enjoy it. And there's a lot to this story, and we've done a lot of work, and you'll see our team is really large in this Gotham Coyote Project thing we've created. And so I am not able to touch on everything. So yeah, I actually, the Gotham Coyote Project is a collaboration of many different people, many different organizations. I actually work for a place called the Mianus River Gorge, which is a land trust in southern New York. We're actually located in Westchester County, which is the county just north of New York City. So we're in the region, and I've kind of been able to convince my board and my boss that, and I think they agree now, that this research that isn't necessarily on our land is still relevant and still important and worth the gorge performing. And so as it stands now, I'm probably the scientist that's able to put the most time into Gotham Coyote directly in terms of field work and coordinating people. But there's a lot of partners involved, and none of us are like, you know, Gotham Coyote is their day job, right? So all of us try to bring what time and resources we can to make this possible, and we do that through, you know, again, everyone doing what they can. We bring in students and interns whenever possible. We've supported graduate students from Fordham University, Pace University, most recently Columbia. You know, we've had the great help of New York City Parks, but primarily it's the Gorge and some folks at the Museum of Natural History in New York City. So that said, like going on, you know, when we think about the coyote, I say this, when we think about the coyote, we think of this Western, tiny, relatively small canid, but obviously that's changing, and most people, now more people think about the coyote in the way that I'm about to describe them as different than this, slightly different than this. But traditionally, you know, the story of the coyote is this prairie wolf, this smaller, you know, the smaller relative of the wolf. And certainly that was true as far as we can tell, as far as the paleontologists can tell us. There really weren't any coyotes on either of the coasts. There's a little more argument, I believe, about whether the coyote may have lived west of the Rockies, but we did have the eastern wolf here, say 2,000, 3,000 years ago, but the coyote was sort of restricted to the Great Plains and the prairies out west. And then, so I bring that up only to say, you know, oftentimes we talk about in the Northeast and other places, you know, lots of wildlife species returning. So we've, in Westchester, you guys may have be used to this in some way, but we're starting to see finally black bears come back. And this is, you know, 50 to 60 miles outside of New York City. So it's kind of interesting. We're seeing bobcats become more common and fishers returning. And so, you know, a lot of that is framed as the animals returning. But I think with the coyote, it's a slightly different story. Is that coyotes are showing up apparently for the very first time. They've been in our area now for a long time, but it's still like the first time. They didn't evolve here, and they're going into new places and doing quite well. So somewhere, you know, in the early 1900s, coyotes first started going east and west out of that central area where they historically were found. And usually when they hit the East Coast, the first kind of expansion out of the Great Plains into the East Coast where we live, went kind of over the Great Lakes through Canada. And that had some implications that I won't go into very much now, but I'm certainly happy to talk about it later. But all I will say about that is we had this really, we see a more north to south progression as coyotes recolonize. There we go. I made my own mistake. Colonize our area, even though the larger scale it's going from west to east, right? So now in modern times, you know, last 20 years or something, all of these different, this northern route and the southern route, and now we have, you know, interplay even back west again in terms of interbreeding and gene flow. All of this is getting mixed up. Can everyone see the cursor on the screen? Can I gesticulate with the wildly with the arrow? Very good. Okay, so but that first story is one that went up around the Great Lakes and then came down the East Coast. And as you can see too, I'll also mention, you know, now they extend all the way up into Alaska and they go all the way down into Central America. They're now being observed south of the Panama Canal. So the New York story is one bullet in the story about how coyotes have gone into urban areas, because they're in basically every city in the continental US. And the whole urban thing is just one bullet point in the whole story of all the different places coyotes have managed to explore and thrive in, right? So we're seeing them up here in the boreal forest. We're seeing them on the, you know, edges of the tundra. We're seeing them down in the jungle. So the only place they aren't really found is you know, the really far away islands like Cuba or Hawaii or Bermuda, which that may be kind of hard. But also this place called Long Island, which I'll show you in a moment. So here's a zoomed in map of the metropolitan area around New York City. New York City itself is in red. And if you're not familiar with the geography, you know, you have mainland New York. This is Westchester County that I've mentioned a couple of times. This kind of weird shaped thingy. That's where I live. I live right about here. Connecticut, New Jersey, some of Pennsylvania. And New York City is right on the water. There's only one part of it, one county of it, or borough as we call them, the Bronx, which is on the mainland, and the others are all part of an island or make up an entire island, like the island of Manhattan or Staten Island. So this really big island is called Long Island, and on Long Island, the western part is Queens and Brooklyn, and Long Island, the non-NYC parts of Long Island are Nassau County here and Suffolk County here. And the reason I bring this up is we fully expected from day one that one day coyotes would make their way through the city and out into Long Island, because they weren't here. They haven't been recorded here until very recently. And in terms of recordings, I'm talking about breeding populations. These are, you know, highly mobile animals that can travel hundreds of miles if they want to. So, you know, there's records of coyotes being sighted in New York City that go back to the 40s and stuff, but those were wanderers. And when we're when we're talking about the ecology of an animal, you know, we really want to think about breeding populations, right? Long-term establishment and persistence through time. In addition, you know, a single animal of an odd species is not going to have that much impact on the community around it or the ecosystem around it. But once you start getting a population and breeding and numbers, then you can start asking, you know, what is happening to the rest of the biological community because of this new species. And so that's when I said coyotes didn't live on Long Island. I mean, permanent breeding populations. There certainly could be wanderers, and they have been even in the last few years, in lone individuals that are, you know, photographed and sent to my email. And those are very interesting, but I'm really interested in watching the spread of the breeding range, right? So what we've got here is a situation where the animals are, if they are going to make it out to Long Island, where that habitat is very suburban and even extends into a rural type place, which resembles very much the suburbs and exurbs of New York, Connecticut, Jersey, Pennsylvania, where we know coyotes are doing very well. So we fully expect them to flourish in Long Island but they first need to push through the city. And so we want to study two things, you know, how do they get through the city, and do they also flourish in this extremely urban area? And we expect them to some degree, but where and how and what sort of things or factors lead to, you know, successful persistence of a breeding family or a population versus places that they simply can't, right? Can they make it in Central Park? I don't know. They may be able to make it in, you know, one of the much larger parks in the Bronx or something. So we're trying to find those threshold points. But in addition, they can walk to the Bronx, but every other borough, like I said, is some part of an island, so they've got to cross water. And I'll show you some closer maps where you can see those crossings that they need to make, and they've certainly caused bottlenecks and kind of a slowing of this progression. But but they're doing it, and they have done it, and it's just a matter of time before this X goes away. Our main way to find coyotes is using camera traps. I'm sure many of you know what these are, but they're weatherproof cameras, digital cameras you can strap to a tree, and they have an infrared trigger. So if something bigger than a squirrel walks in front of it, if everything's working properly, it'll take a picture. And so you end up with the modern cameras, these really rapid fire pictures. So it's not video, although they do have video cameras, and we use those sometimes. Most of our cameras take stills like this, but they can take them really fast. And so this is just a series of pictures of a coyote family in the Bronx in 2015. It was one of the few times, usually we'll see 2 or 1, but this was in the non-breeding season, or just the beginning of the breeding season, when we actually had 5, which indicates that this is a pair, an adult pair with the young that were born the year before. So these guys maybe just turned 1 year old, along with the 2 parents. And that happens sometimes. They stay for a year or 2, just like wolves. So when we started in 2010, nobody knew anything about our coyotes in New York. Who the heck knows? We've gotten a few sightings in the 90s and here and there, but let's take a look. And nobody else was doing this work. There's so many organizations in New York City that, study tigers and elephants and great white sharks. But you go to like the WCS and the Museum of Natural History, and we're like, you study anything like outside your door? And they're like, no. Who's interested in that? These dirty varmints living in the subways or whatever. So we took it upon ourselves to do it. And I had worked in the city for a long time. I did my graduate work on screech owls, actually living in City Park. So I knew the parks very well. And a few of my colleagues, were also local New Yorkers, and they knew the area and had access to, like, I think we started with 9 cameras, and now we have, 50 or so. So our first year, though, we went out and looked in a bunch of parks once we finally got permits, and we found coyotes in 3 places, in the Bronx and 1 in Queens, which I'll show you in a moment. And these are, really big parks right on the border of Westchester. So it's obvious that these were the first places that coyotes set up shop. And then as we kept looking and looking over time, we found that not only were we finding coyotes in new places, but they started breeding in new places. So as gray goes to blue, that means we have a successful denning event. And all of these sites have had many years in a row of having pups. So this is kind of like the source for all the young coyotes going out elsewhere into the city. If we go down in Queens, like I said, there was 1, I think I said this, but there was 1 from about 2009 coyote living in this tiny little park way down in southern Queens, oddly. And he's still there, and he's getting old. He's at least 10 years old now. So every year I put up a camera, and I hope he hasn't passed on. And so far, so good. We also started receiving more and more sightings. These green icons are sightings that we were able to confirm or had, we thought were legit. And eventually we did get a den in 2016 and had reason to believe we just missed in 2015 also. So they'd probably been breeding there two years in a row. That family was unfortunately removed by the Port Authority because it was too close to the airport or something. But as of 2020, there's 1 left from that large family that I mentioned. There's still the old guy down here. And then we actually have 2 new places that are technically now in Nassau County. And you can even see from the aerial, like the amount of green when you enter Nassau County versus Queens and Brooklyn. This is, once these guys get breeding, and we suspect that at least this pair and possibly this site is a pair of coyotes, and this site possibly a pair of coyotes, a separate pair. So we could have 2 dens. I don't think they bred this year, but maybe next year. And that's how it starts. That's how it goes. So we're kind of excited about that, and we're expanding our work out into Long Island. But within the city, I wanted to give you an idea of like where we tend to find these coyotes. And I have to start with the caveat that, we're really only able to put cameras in places that we would call green spaces. Parks are number 1, but even cemeteries, golf courses, botanical gardens or a zoo or something, and large places where there is some vegetation. Now there could be coyotes living out there, you know, in an abandoned building with a den and a old refrigerator or something. But it's very hard for us to sample that. Can you imagine doing searches like that? And we really haven't gotten any sightings that would indicate that. There's certainly been instances of lone coyotes wandering through and kind of getting stuck, and everyone sees it in the middle of the day on top of a bar, such as this one. Or in Central Park living alone. There's actually, it's fairly recent. It's been there a year now. There've been several coyotes that show up in Central Park, and they either leave or when, you know, people hadn't gotten used to the idea quite yet, and it's changed over time, but they would be removed. But this guy has somehow figured out that, you know, if he doesn't bother anyone and you know, he's been there a year basically. So he's by himself. And I think the habitat requirements for a coyote living on their own versus successfully denning are quite different. And so while a coyote can live almost anywhere, you know, again, we're thinking about denning and reproduction and population, you know, establishment. Denning may be a little harder, and I think they do need some amount of, you know, cover, vegetation, and some amount, at least during part of the year, where they have an area where people just don't go. And I'll show you some. So if you're a coyote, the first place you'd probably choose to live if you want to live in the city is one of these big parks. This is Van Cortlandt Park, and it's about 1,400 acres. And then you've got this cemetery right next to it. That's another whatever acres, you know, it looks like about a third more. And so on top of that, this big park has a few sections of really big woodlands, lots of other animals, lots of cover. It's got a golf course, which we know coyotes can use that as well. They're not too interested in these large lawns, but they like golf courses okay. And then the cemetery is to some degree usable as well. So this is a nice big area, and this is probably the first place you would look if you're thinking where are coyotes, and sure enough, that's where they ended up. So that's cool, and I'm glad we found them, and I'm glad they're doing well, but a little more interesting to me are these sort of edge cases where, you know, there's certain parks that I would never expect coyotes to dwell in or use as their, you know, central, like, home range, that are just lawns with maybe a parking lot and a swing set. But you have these other ones, like this is Ferry Point Park, which has a big lawn, it has a big golf course, it has a major highway going through it onto the Whitestone Bridge. There's these little patches of woods. And so this patch over here is highly crisscrossed with trails, and people are in it all the time. So I don't think that's very valuable to the coyotes, again, as core territory. They certainly can forage in it, maybe for a squirrel or a rabbit or something. Over here is another strip of woodlands that sees some use, but is a little more private. But right here is a strip of vegetation that's just miserable for people. It's land that's not leased by the golf course. It's basically fenced on all sides, except for the side that faces the golf course, which nobody really crosses because the golfers aren't interested in going there. And you have the ocean, basically Long Island Sound, the East River on the other end. So there's a nice private place. People don't go. It's only about, I believe, 14 acres, but that's where the den is, right? So if you have this minimum area that they can use for a den, they'll do it and be successful, where people just don't go. And if they can have that, then you can have them set up shop in an otherwise pretty, you know, low quality site, at least at first glance. So this is that site. This is that strip I mentioned. It's just in the spring, you go through it and you're just covered in hundreds of dog ticks. It's just not a nice place, but it's great for the coyotes because nobody ever goes there. And this is the Whitestone Bridge overlooking it. And this is just a view of the other side. The other place you find coyotes are in these neighborhoods. And there really aren't many coyotes in New York City. You know, we estimate, you know, there's probably 7 or 8, possibly 10, depending on what year, you know, places where coyotes live. And so then there may be a few we missed. You know, we estimate around 20 to 30 coyotes in the whole city. So it's really not that many, but there are some patterns. And one of the patterns, I've shown you 2, the big parks, the smaller parks, but has this like really key, you know, private zone. And then you have a place that's like Riverdale, which is up in the Bronx, which is, you know, there is Riverdale Park here, which is a nice forest, but you also have this like almost suburban neighborhood. And we know, because we've actually, it's challenging, but we've put cameras in the neighborhood on people's yards and such. And the coyotes use the whole place. So most of the time, if you've got, park, super urban, area around it, and another park, the coyotes certainly can use both parks and move in between. And I'll show you some maps of that. But they're really just using that urban area to run through at night. But in this sort of neighborhood, they actually can use this as habitat. They have resources here. They forage here. There might be water here. They can actually put a den here. And you can see this is like, it's a small little road, single family house. You do have some big buildings, some big roads, but it's quite different than what you'd picture of New York City, right? This is a camera that was monitoring an area that turned out to be a den site in that Riverdale area. And this is another pattern that we found that's pretty interesting. I think it's interesting. Where, this was a den put right in the middle of an apartment complex. There's walking paths, people bike and ride, walk their dogs all over it. But again, there's this one little parcel behind this wood chip pile that was, you can see it's utterly like just weeded and vines and brambles and everything back there. No person would go back there, but the coyote can sneak in there and put it in and dig a den. And that's what they did. But it still wasn't quite big enough or quite private enough. When the pups were this size and they started coming out and playing, and the adults were there watching them, and people would walk by, with their dog, it was sort of an issue. The adult coyotes would stand there and, look protective of their space. And certainly the dogs and the people didn't like it very much either. So what we see a lot is if we have a den in these kind of, and I say a lot, I mean, we have a handful of examples, and I'm trying to infer generalities from these very small population and very young population. We do what we can, but we've seen it a few times where, a den will be set up in what ends up being a sort of problematic location. They won't come back. What usually is happening, I think, is these are first year breeding adult coyotes. They start breeding, they pick a den site in February. And so people are not out riding their bikes in these places or visiting or hiking in these sorts of places. It looks quiet, it looks clear, so the coyotes give it a shot. Come spring, the people show up and the pups are born, and you get into these issues. In both of the cases that I'm thinking of where there's actually probably 3 cases, the coyotes didn't try again in the second year. And so when I speak with people, when I speak with the city, I say, if you can just get through this first year, like the coyotes don't like this situation either, and they won't come back. And hopefully they'll pick a better spot. So that's just another thing. Once we find a place that has coyotes, and even if it's kind of once we find the coyote reliably enough to warrant our time, we spend a lot of time looking for scat. That's what this handsome gentleman is playing with 2 sticks, is an actual coyote poop. And we collect it. And my job is generally the collecting of it, which is really the nicest part of it all. Once you bring it back to the lab, this is Carol Henger, who recently was at Fordham, recently just defended her dissertation on looking at the scat and what we can get from it. We can get both the DNA of the coyote themselves, the coyote that defecated the scat, and we can get information in 2 ways about the prey, about what the coyote's eating. The first way, the folks at the Museum of Natural History kind of handle is once Carol scrapes the DNA off the scat, she sends it to the Museum of Natural History, and they look through it for prey remains. So this is hair, teeth, bones, wrappers, if they're eating, garbage. And we try to identify what that is, and you can score the diet that way. The other thing that Carol more recently figured out too is she can take some of the fecal matter itself and like broadcast, genotype the fecal matter itself. It sounds delightful, doesn't it? But you can learn a lot from it, and she can actually get things like, say, if she finds wheat in there or cow, right? Then you know that they're probably eating garbage because there's no wild cows or wild wheat plants out there. So they're eating a sandwich or something. They're eating a hamburger in that case. And a lot of the anthropogenic stuff does not show up very well in the morphological analysis, because there's no remains if they eat ground beef, right? There's no cow bone in there, right? If they eat fried chicken, you can find it. Or if they eat something with a wrapper and they eat the wrapper too, you can find it. But you won't find, you'll see in a moment, she found things like bananas and peas. You won't find that morphologically. So both of them complement each other. I'll talk for a moment about the genetic stuff, which I was really excited about because it can, next to telemetry, it's probably the most detail we can get. Telemetry is where you actually put collars on the animals. So each of these dots, this is the Bronx, right, going into northern Manhattan. And the green is basically canopy cover, so trees. And the gray would be pavement, things like that. Each of the red dots is a place we found to poop. And so every time we find a poop, we take a GPS so we can map them. The lines connecting different red dots or different scat indicate a first order relationship. So that's a parent or a parent to offspring or two siblings, right? So they're sharing approximately 50% of their DNA with each other. So they're 50% similar. And that indicates that they're very related, i.e., you share 50% of your DNA with your parents and your siblings. So what this told us, and we suspected this, but it's nice to confirm these sort of things because you could always be wrong, is that every individual green space, and she has since filled out this map much more with new poop, but every individual green space kind of has its own family. So they defend any contiguous area. There aren't two different coyote families on this side of the highway and this side of the highway, or there aren't one coyote family up here and one coyote family here. They use the whole green space, right? If we look at the whole city, we add in what we call second order relationships, which is sharing about 25% of your DNA with each other. So that would be half sibling, grandparents to grandchild, or aunts, uncles to niece, nephew, right? They're related, but they're not as closely related as parent and an offspring. So this is showing the extended family throughout the whole city. So basically, Carol's conclusion here was that a few pairs established in the North Bronx, and all these other colonization events and denning events that we found have been offspring of those original pairs, like moving their way, leapfrogging their way to the next adjacent park. And certainly, there's a lot of death involved in these sort of success stories, right? A coyote doesn't have a map or a guide to get to the next park. It just, when it's time for it to leave its parents and go find a territory of its own, it just does its best guess and possibly goes in a random direction, gets hit by a car, or just gets lost and goes 300 miles north and ends up, back in Westchester. But some of them find these little green islands and set up shop. And most likely, I'm excited to get scat from those two NASA observations that were here and here, and see, did they come directly from this family? Did they make their way around? They can tell us something about the family tree, but also, the routes they might have taken. All right, I'm running out of time, but we'll talk a little bit about what Carol found in the diet analysis. We got so much from Carol's work, and it was a coordinated effort, but she found like all these different species amongst our urban coyotes, and she compared them to data from non-urban sites, so places, I believe, upstate and New Jersey. And so you can see that, and then group them into categories. So we've got all the rodents, rabbits, deer, other mammals, raccoons and such, birds, vegetation, anthropogenic, and then kind of miscellaneous salamanders or bugs. And you can see that they're not differing too much. More deer upstate, which is not surprising. There aren't many deer in New York City. More of the mammals, a lot more vegetation in the urban areas and more anthropogenic in the urban areas, which isn't all that shocking. More birds was interesting. But if you look at exactly what they're eating, that might be anthropogenic. You certainly see a little bit of cat. You see cow, goat, sheep. You actually get, guinea fowl, because there's lots of different cuisines in New York City. Tuna, they're probably, you never know, maybe they caught a tuna, but probably eating that from garbage. And then a lot of different vegetation they couldn't possibly get: banana, prunes, pears, and sort of thing. So telling us that, yeah, garbage and is certainly playing a role. When you bear down a little more finer in this is highly skewed by location. So some places they're eating more, some places they're eating more natural food, some places they're eating more human-sourced food. We would ideally like to see this be very low, because the more coyotes get fed, either directly or indirectly by people, the more you tend to have problems. We were able finally to get some telemetry data. I'll be quick about this. This is that Ferry Point Park. The den is in this park, but they definitely use this park over here and this park over here. What was interesting to us is this is one individual, but all the individuals we collared from this family did this. They travel from park to park using the coastline. And the coastlines here are not like beachfront property, or these are like industrially, lots and big commercial parking lots and construction zones and tide walls, like big boulder tide walls. And so they're avoiding people. They could easily have just gone right over here through the neighborhoods if they wish, but they're avoiding where the people are, where the cars are, and trying to stick to the most out of the way places as possible. And that's good. That's what we want to see. I don't know if this is the case for every coyote family out there, but this family seems to be doing what we as managers and officials would like to see. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip some stuff. One thing I did want to hit was we are trying to dabble in looking at the human side of this question, and almost in a much larger perspective for coyote-human coexistence and in wildlife coexistence in an urban setting. I mean, we have more of our team from Pace University does this sort of work with human perceptions of nature and where do animals fit in people's worldviews. For example, they did a paper comparing Westchester County, that county just outside the city, and people in the city. They did a survey with people from both places and asked them, are coyotes part of nature? Most people said yes. I don't know what people know that said no mean. If they're not part of nature, what are they part of? But the interesting part for us was some people said, yeah, they're part of nature, but not here. Not here, meaning either New York City or Westchester. That slice was very small in Westchester, but very high or substantially big in New York City. So there's this perception or kind of mental frame of the city. It's fine. Animals are nature, and nature is great, but this is not nature. Where I live is not natural. And of course, the animals don't see those sort of, arbitrary divisions. And the coyote is sort of can be used, in many ways as a symbol of throwing that in our faces in so many ways. But one of the ways it gets people to think about, well, what do you mean? The coyotes are here, so is that unnatural? We didn't put them here, right? So what does that mean, and how do you feel about that? Should coyotes be allowed to live here? That's another loaded question that I could go on about for quite a while. Do we have a choice? We wouldn't even get to that, but should they be allowed to live here? And again, this was surprising to me in a place in Westchester where coyotes are more numerous and more common and have been there longer. You certainly get more people complaining about them, I thought. And that's sort of my experience when people call me. But it wasn't the case. Most of the people that were surveyed from Westchester thought it was just fine. And we had kind of had a 50-50 split on whether people were cool with coyotes being around. A lot of people just didn't even know when they were asked. Did you know coyotes lived here? I had no idea. So this is indicative of a lot of social research, especially with coyotes and other predators. There was another interesting survey that I'll just mention, and then I promise I'm finished, done by Cornell, where they said, they asked people, have you ever had a negative interaction with coyotes? And some people said yes, some people said no. Out of the people who said yes, they asked them to characterize the interaction. And the number one answer was, I saw one. And so that framing of I saw a coyote, that's bad, you know, is a fact. It's something we have to think about and deal with. But if you're like me, interested in promoting coexistence between people, coyotes, and other wildlife, even in urban areas, that's something you gotta deal with and think about ways to probably change. To that end, the city has really stepped up, trying to promote coyotes and lots of other wildlife. These are actual ads that are put on the subway and buses and taxis that you could see, and there's a whole suite of them. The coyote head is replaced with deer and falcons and raccoons, and you know, they haven't done the rat one yet, but you know, trying to promote this idea that, like, you know, we're all New Yorkers, and you know, you New Yorkers have this real, like, they put a lot of value in their kind of self-identifying as New Yorkers, as I'm sure you know. And also this idea of like, people can come to New York and over time become a New Yorker, right? So I think they're playing on that a little bit, and I think it's very clever. We've also, a student of ours just took a quick photograph of this. These are like trivia podiums that are all over the Midtown, and that just show any number of things, like, you know, there's 15 billion toilets in New York City or whatever it is, but this was one of the things that shows up, which was really interesting, and we appreciate that. I had no idea they were going to do that, but we were lucky enough to get a picture of it. So I know I moved fast. I wanted to cover a lot of things, but I can answer any questions. I'm happy to stay a little late, and thank you. You're muted.
Oh, wow, that was great. Really great. People are just giving thumbs up, and then we do have a ton of questions. So I'm going to start with the ones that are kind of more natural history focused. And one of the very first questions was, what is driving the coyotes expansion from that first slide where you showed it, where they started, to kind of where they've gone? So what's the driving force?
Yeah, you know, well, on the coyotes end, it's just that, you know, nature of any, you know, organism to have more babies than it is, right? So every organism has the capacity to replace itself and then some. And so the expansion of coyotes, just from the coyotes end, you know, they just have pups, and the pups need to go somewhere, so they leave and wander into new places. Why all of a sudden, you know, that was possible, right? Like, why didn't this happen 500 years ago? There's a couple answers that are commonly given, and they certainly probably played a role. The two are, well, maybe the three are, you know, we removed all the bigger predators, and coyotes coexist with things like wolves and mountain lions, but they're certainly, you know, kind of subordinate in the chain of supremacy in those places. I mean, there's a joke that, like, you know, why can a coyote run 45 miles per hour? That's pretty fast. It's because a wolf can run 40 miles an hour. So on one hand, we've removed those predators and possibly opening up, you know, new niche and new opportunities for this smaller guy that can hack it in these smaller spaces in amongst humans. But again, they coexisted with wolves, and you know, there's no reason to think they wouldn't have at least expanded possibly more slowly. I mean, that doesn't answer it 100% for me either, but that's certainly a factor. And then the second factor is, similarly, humans stopped probably killing them as much, although we still kill hundreds of thousands of coyotes a year. And a good portion of that is simply to try to eradicate coyotes. It's kind of sick, but you know, all that stuff, you know, worked on wolves, worked on cougars, worked on grizzly bears, didn't work on coyotes. And I often say, you know, coyotes are an example of how bad we are at wildlife management, because we've tried for about 100 years to eradicate them, and it's completely failed.
So Chris, is part of the reason it fails is because when their population is low down, they have more pups?
Yeah, there's definitely that response. Some people have proposed that it's, you know, a direct physiological response, but that evidence is a little shaky. It's really just more like, if you kill a whole bunch of them, there's just more for the ones that are left, and more resources, more space, and that happens with a lot of animals. But coyotes on a landscape exist if you have a more traditional contiguous landscape of suitable habitat. So like, Yellowstone or something. You'll have, these territorial resident pairs that are breeding, but then kind of overlaid on that is this whole kind of subpopulation of transient, usually younger coyotes looking for a slot. So once that male dies, then some young male can come in and that female will take him on as her new mate and immediately fill that gap. And so they're super mobile, they can disperse long distances, and there always are these extras that can fill in where one was taken out. So they rebound very quickly, and they do have the capacity to have a lot of pups. Usually they have 4 to 7, which is a lot in and of itself every year. But sometimes they can get into the teens if food is abundant.
Wow, that's great. All right, here's interesting question, because people are curious about your scat collecting, and how can you tell the difference between coyote scat and dog scat? Since they might be eating a lot of human food, how do you do the difference? And do you ever make a mistake?
Yeah, we make mistakes. So first off, we have a couple dogs that are trained on coyote scat. One is owned by my friend Ferdy, and he's a dog trainer, so his is very good. And then there's my dog, who's pretty good. And they seem to, Scout, Ferdy's dog especially, can differentiate on smell. Visually, you can do it pretty well, especially if you're dealing with a coyote eating a lot of normal food. Wild canids have wild canid scat has a very distinctive appearance, and you can Google it, but it tends to be, pretty dry, long. It looks almost twisted. It has these like spindly ends. But you're right, as a coyote may start eating more garbage and things like that, stuff with like much higher, moisture content or something, then it does get tricky. And we genotype, Carol had a procedure that would, and they're so closely related, it is tough, but there are a few loci in dogs and coyotes that you can differentiate the two. So we did our best in the field. If I was doubtful, I usually collected it just in case. And then Carol would double check it in the lab.
Wow, I'm curious about when you double check, when you're doing the DNA in the lab. Up here in our neck of the woods, you'll hear lots of old timers say, "Oh, we don't have coyotes, we have coy dogs." Yeah. That's something that you hear often. And then there's been a lot of study about the DNA of the eastern coyote having some mixture to it. And I'm curious if your study has revealed any interbreeding of coyotes with domestic dog, or if you've seen any evidence of other types of interbreeding.
Yeah, basically, we don't study that specifically. The stuff that, when you do genetics, you're using different parts of the genome to answer different questions, so you can't do it all. But those people who have looked at the eastern coyote time and time again, every single one they sample has a mixture of wolf and dog background. And I can show you actually, if you don't mind me sharing my screen again. This is my little coy wolf slide, but I don't have to do everything. But you get, what we find on average is, 60-something% coyote, and then a mixture of all the other canis species, eastern wolf, gray wolf, and dog. And any individual on the East Coast has this mixture. So the coyote in your backyard, you could call it a coy wolf if you wanted to. The dog tends to be the rarest. And we think that in most cases, the dog background is hitchhiking on the wolf. So the wolf ancestor that this guy had was also part dog. We think that direct in the wild breeding between dogs and coyotes is pretty rare. It's not impossible, but there's a few barriers to make it very common. But the coy wolf story is interesting. There are eastern wolves up in Algonquin Provincial Park in Canada and the surrounding areas there. And that remember, if going over the Great Lakes into through Canada and then down through Maine and New Hampshire, that's where the coyotes mixed with the wolves directly. And then the descendants of those, it's still happening there now, these F1 hybrids, but all the coyotes we have on the East Coast are hybrids breeding with each other. So they're not, the term coy wolf is a little tricky for me because it implies to some people, you know, wolf dad, coyote mother. But in reality, any coyote in the eastern U.S., New Hampshire and New York and everywhere else, is like a hybrid that was, you know, parents were hybrids, grandparents were hybrids, great grandparents were hybrids. It's several, many generations back that you had the wolf.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard people call them wolfodies.
Yeah. Yeah, there's people asking for it to be a separate species. Most people think, you know, it's way too early to tell. They call it a hybrid swarm. Basically, just means it's a whole mess, and you can see that with that diagram.
So cool.
But yeah, like, you know, I usually have that in my talks, but I didn't want. Inevitably, someone asks,
Yeah.
so I stuck those slides at the end. But yeah, it's a great question. I wouldn't say. I mean, they're just all like that, right? So don't, if a newspaper says coy wolf spotted, that's no different than the thing they called a coyote last week, because they're all like that here.
Yeah.
And they all tend to be a little bit bigger, you know, 10 pounds on average. So out west in a prairie, you get a 25 to 35 pound coyote on average. Here you get 35 to 45. And they've had them big up to 60 pounds. But again, you know, looking at like an eastern wolf is like 90 pounds and a gray wolf is like 100 pounds, 120 pounds. So you're still talking about a big gap there.
Yeah, great answer. Loved it. Love the slide showing the amount of different canines in the coyote. There's lots of questions about coexistence between coyotes and humans. And one question is, does the Gotham Coyote Project or you personally have any suggestions if a person encounters a coyote? There seems to be a lot of different there's lots of different information out there. So I'm curious, and how often are people encountering coyotes in your urban settings?
Yeah, New York is still very much on the, you know, the zone you want, where coyotes are just running away, usually as soon as they see someone. We don't want people to try to feed them and all that sort of thing. So the number one thing for coexisting with coyotes is don't feed them. If you don't like coyotes, don't feed them. If you like coyotes, don't feed them, because that'll just lead to problems and then they'll have to be removed. So, you know, it's very hard. I've sort of stepped away from giving, you know, recommendations. There's lots of resources out there. And certainly if you're like hiking and a coyote walks in front of you, it doesn't want that situation to have happened either. It's, you know, really not hunting you or anything like that. They will run away. The exception to that is if you've stumbled across a den, right? And even then they'll probably run away, but there is this boundary where you may be standing where they're going to stand there and watch you until you leave. And so that's going to be, you know, April, probably till the beginning of June. And so I would treat the situation slightly differently during that time of year. If you encounter a coyote, say if you're hiking, in most cases you could yell at it or even ignore it, maybe go the other direction. But the two cases, like I said, that time of year, and particularly if you're walking a dog, it'll view that dog as possibly different than it'll view a human. It may treat that dog differently, see it as a threat or as something coming to either predate it. It could even see a small dog as a possible prey item. But those things are very, very rare. And in most cases, you can scare them off. And that's sort of where I stop making recommendations, because after that, you start getting into, you know, well, I saw a coyote in my backyard and it was on the porch, and I want to help people. And that's actually another arm of our research that's getting started, I hope this spring, where we go to sites and people report sort of these problems or at least concerns, and we can evaluate the specific behavior of those coyotes. Because it's very hard for me to give someone like, here's what you should have done the other day when you saw a coyote in this particular situation. Because the overall recommendations are make yourself look big, yell, or ignore it, right? I've seen coyotes several times in the wild, and every single time it was its butt running away from me. It watched me for a while, and then it just took off. And even when there were pups, one time the mom ran away and the pup was just standing there. So like, nice job, Mom. But so they're really, if they haven't been habituated, if we haven't been taught that humans can provide food or represent some association with food, then they're going to run away. And it's only when you get into problems with feeding, either directly or indirectly, that you get this loss of fear. And there's ways you can intervene. And that's where, again, I want to be on the ground to see the conditions there before I make, recommendations.
Yeah, great answer. Loved it. And that's good information. And so if you're somebody who is in this Zoom and you're in kind of the Gotham Coyotes area, it sounds like if you have more questions or interactions, you can reach out to Gotham Coyote Project, which would be great. I'm curious, and so are a few other people, if your studies of what you're finding, your research is published anywhere, and can people read it more? Find out
Yes,
more
on
about.
our website, which is gothamcoyote.org, we have a list of all our academic publications and a few other posters and conference things we put up. You can look me up on ResearchGate if anyone has got an account there. We're on Facebook as well, so if we publish something, I'll usually announce it on there. But we've published a few papers. That the social survey study, that's published. Most of what Carol's done, she's gotten published. I did a paper or two on, mapping their distribution and changes over time, like I was showing on those maps. So yeah, we have a couple, 7 or 8 papers at this point.
That's great. Well, I think we're just about out of time, Chris. And I know that if you were at the Harris Center and all of us were here, you'd probably get a big standing ovation. Applause. That was really fabulous. Just great work. And it's so good to hear about the work that you're doing and to find out how the Coyotes are making a living of it. And I guess if people are interested in finding out more about Gotham Coyote, check it out. I spent a lot of time on the website, and one thing I love is how you work with students and inspiring younger people to go into wildlife and wildlife research. I just think that's a really fabulous part of your project, and I encourage everybody to visit the website and read up on that. But yeah, thank you so much.
No, this was fun. And yeah, you can reach me in any of those sources. And if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to email me.
Oh, great. There
I'll
were
do
a
what I
lot more
can.
questions. Well, thank you everybody. And maybe we'll see some of you for Gotham Taxidermy, which will also be quite interesting on September 10th. So thanks, Chris.
All right. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Good night.
Good night.